Hi, thanks for tuning in. My name is Konrad Kollnig, and I'm a current PhD student at the Computer Science Department of the University of Oxford. Motivated by Apple's new privacy measures on iOS, my colleagues and I set out to investigate the effects of these measures on app privacy. On the one hand, Apple introduced the so-called App Tracking Transparency Framework, the ATT. This allows end users to choose which apps are allowed to track them. Apps without consent cannot access the IDFA anymore, the identifier for advertisers. The IDFA used to facilitate cross-app tracking and could pose a substantial privacy threat to end users. Various reports suggest that the majority of users, between 60 and 95%, choose to refuse tracking when asked for it under the new system. Apple also introduced so-called privacy nutrition labels, which are meant to show to end users what types of data apps collect and for what purposes. Both measures were introduced as part of iOS 14, starting from December 2020. The ATT, however, was only activated with iOS 14.5 in April 2021, so about a year ago. Apple's new privacy measures have been rather controversial and received a fierce response by the advertising industry. Facebook even decided to run a public ad campaign against Apple across the Washington Post and other newspapers. While potentially good for user privacy, the ATT has also been reported to have vastly increased Apple's share of advertising on iOS. As regards our methodology, we looked into roughly 1,800 pairs of apps. For each app, we looked at one version from 2020 and one version that has been updated to comply with the new rules. To get a rich picture of apps' privacy practices, we considered both apps' code in a code analysis and apps' network traffic. We also downloaded the new privacy labels. All of this is building on methodology for iOS app privacy analysis from previous research from our research group. Our main findings are twofold. First, we find that tracking is more difficult now due to reduced access to the IDFA and also restrictions on data brokers and other companies who used to engage in tracking. However, it still continues, and it's unclear what might really bring things to a halt and respect users' choices. Secondly, the privacy nutrition labels are sometimes inaccurate and as a result might mislead some end users. Looking first at the privacy nutrition labels, we found some discrepancy between observed and disclosed data practices. I'd like to go over one example of that now. More details can be found in our paper. Specifically, we found that 22% of apps said in their privacy nutrition labels that they wouldn't collect any data at all. However, closer inspection showed that 80% of these apps actually contained at least one tracking library, as can be seen in the presented figure on the slide. 69% of the apps were found to send data to known tracking domains right at the first app start. What explains this discrepancy between observed and disclosed data practices? Well, one important reason probably is that many app publishers just don't know what data practices the third-party SDKs engage in and what they have to self-disclose in the privacy nutrition labels. Beyond restricting access to the IDFA, the ATT also excludes a range of further tracking practices. In our paper, we found, however, that the underlying definition of tracking leaves certain gaps and doesn't cover all tracking. For tracking to fall under Apple's definition, it must fulfill 3 conditions. They are highlighted in the slide, or be done by a data broker. These conditions are surprisingly specific, particularly the framing around prohibited data practices. Apple's definition of tracking further hinges on a distinction between first-party and third-party data collection, despite the fact that this is not usually the root of privacy problems. We discuss this more in our paper. In addition to the definition of tracking, Apple actually foresees a list of exemptions from the definition of tracking, and that includes credit scoring obviously credit scoring can be highly invasive. So we found that rather surprising. The reason for excluding credit scoring is likely a US credit scoring law. Apple is merely trying to avoid falling under the definition of this US credit scoring laws by exempting tracking credit scoring. It might still have significant effects for end users if the ATT doesn't prevent credit scoring from happening within apps, tracking being used as part of credit scoring. Looking at tracking libraries in code, there was hardly any change. The same goes for opt-in permissions that are requested by apps at runtime. Note that we didn't look into whether apps actually requested these permissions, just whether apps could theoretically request these permissions at runtime by analyzing the app manifest files. The reason for the limited change is likely due to the fact that we only looked at apps that were already on the App Store before the new policies. We made this choice because many of the most popular apps will fall under this definition. However, new apps might adopt different strategies, so future work should address the privacy practice in new apps. For now, developers did just not substantially change their existing code base in response to the ATT. It is somewhat surprising still that there was so little change in existing data practices. Apple's new privacy rules seem to have sparked a counter-movement by tracking companies. Specifically, we found a real-world example of apps circumventing the ATT through device fingerprinting. These apps managed to agree on a mutual user identifier through the use of a third-party server. Specifically, the apps in question sent a range of information about a user's device, including the iPhone name, which often contains the first and last name of the iPhone user, free storage on the iPhone device, country, iPhone model, time zone, operating system version, etc. to a third-party server. Together with the IP address and potentially further information, this server then generated a unique user identifier that could be used to track user activity across different apps. This is, according to our reading, in violation of the ATT. Due to these observations, especially our real-world example, we conclude that tracking is still possible through a combination of unique identifiers, IP address, name of the app, device details, and potentially further first-party data. As an example of that, I'm going to walk you through a couple of cases, examples from big tech companies. On the one hand, there's a method by Google that uses sign-in functionality to still track users. It says in the slide, attribution using a user's identifier provided by your app's sign-in experience. So this is an approach to sidestep ATT rules as part of Google Ads. Facebook operates the advanced matching method using hashed email addresses to still track users in a world with ATT and without third-party cookies. And there's also actually frequent data sharing with Apple that can be used to track user activity. We observed this particularly as part of Apple's App Store technology. As part of the in-app payment, various unique identifiers were shared with Apple. Crucially, other app developers don't have access to similar identifiers. For example, apps regularly shared the UDID with Apple, which is an identifier that's been inaccessible to other app developers since 2013. Apps also shared the serial number with Apple regularly. That's the number that's printed on the box of your iPhone at the time of purchase. So this really allows Apple to track device sales accurately and ties in nicely with its business model that's focused on device sales. Since the App Store isn't part of the iOS, is part of the iOS operating system, it likely does not fall under Apple's own review guidelines and is therefore exempt from the tracking rules, from the ATT rules. However, Apple admits in its privacy policy that it may use interactions with App Store technology to show users personalized ads. We try to engage with Apple on this issue and try to invoke our GDPR right to be informed, to learn more about Apple's data collection as part of App Store technology, but unfortunately the company didn't disclose any more details than already provided in the privacy policy. We will follow further up in the future. In sum, there are three main types of iOS tracking after the ATT. Firstly, there's the device fingerprinting, for which we present a real-world example of this taking place, of this still being used to track users, and potentially increasingly being used to track users and circumventing the ATT. This isn't permitted by Apple, but might be tricky for Apple to do something against it, because this really relies on taking all sorts of different pieces of information together in sometimes rather unexpected ways. Secondly, there's first-party tracking, which is commonly done by Google, Facebook, and Apple themselves. This seems to be permitted under the ATT rules and really shows how these new privacy rules might reinforce existing market powers. Lastly, so-called cohort tracking is, or seems still to be permitted as well, according to our findings in the paper, as well as newspaper reports by the Financial Times and other media. Thank you very much for your attention.